right, welcome everybody. So glad to have you along this morning, and we are going to be visiting with our friends from the University of Montana. Dr. Mehrdad joining us, as well as Dr. Michael Meyer, and we are going to talk about foreign policy, or if there is such a thing as the Trump Doctrine. Is that right, Mehrdad?
That's correct. Good morning, Peter.
Good
morning, John. And today our focus will be U.S. foreign policy, and in particular, Trump foreign policy.
Okay.
And we will begin with the question from a foreign policy expert, Professor Michael Meyer, whether there is a Trump doctrine, like a Nixon doctrine, for example. And then from there, hopefully to proceed to some of the flash or conflict zones, such as, of course, North Korea. We cannot avoid that, but a few others.
Well, let me ask you this. First of all, Dr. Meyer, has Donald Trump has time to come up with what you might call a Trump doctrine? He's been in office for 200 days.
Exactly. That's the first point I think is worth making. The Nixon doctrine didn't come until the second administration, actually.
Right, yeah.
The Reagan doctrine came several years into his first term. So most of these the Truman doctrine wasn't until after Truman had won re-election or election.
So are we a little bit premature in asking this question?
A little bit, but I think it's not premature to ask whether there are patterns that seem to be emerging early on, and whether or not there's some sort of coherence to the response to the various hotspots in the world that Mehrdad mentioned.
Let me ask you this: is President Trump being consistent across the board? In other words, does he have? Do you sense a level in him that basically flicks his bick and says, "Okay, enough is enough," and we're going to start being a little bit belligerent at this point?
It's not hard. I don't think you can tell exactly what that level is. Clearly there's a level, but
right,
I think it may vary from place to place.
Or does it level on the threat posed by the opponent rather than just?
I think in North Korea that's clearly the case. But like all presidents, I think he shows more tolerance towards some that other people would regard as dangerous, and responds more aggressively to places that somebody else might say would be maybe less dangerous. People criticize Nixon and Kissinger for coming down hard on third world countries and being more patient or more tolerant of the Soviet Union. Every president is subject to these kinds of analyses and criticisms.
There does seem to be a universal. When Mehrdad texted me the topic for yesterday, I was thinking, boy, what would be the Trump doctrine? I was thinking back to some famous doctrines from other presidents, and one of the big ones for Teddy Roosevelt, the phrase, speak softly and carry a big stick. And I thought about that, and I immediately. For me, what I think of when I think of a Trump foreign policy, it's brag about your big stick. That seems to be the policy. I mean, it doesn't matter who you are. If you're China, if you're Mexico, if you're Australia, talk about how big and powerful you are.
Police. I mean,
and that's the introduction to your foreign policy, and we'll negotiate from there. But I do have a clip of what is being called the fire and fury speech. It was actually not a speech. It was a response to a question while they were talking about opioids, of all things. But after the opioid discussion, a lady in the crowd asked a question about North Korea, and Trump immediately took it. It looked like he took it on the fly. Some people say it was off the cuff. Other people say he's the bad cop, and the rest of the team is the good cop. Who knows? But here's the clip from that segment.
North Korea's nuclear capabilities.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. He has been very threatening beyond a normal statement. And as I said, they will be met with fire, fury, and frankly, power, the likes of which this world has never seen before. Thank you.
Okay.
Now you think, when I first heard this, I was like, oh no, he's gone off the cuff. I still kind of feel, oh no. However, I'm not so sure it was completely off the cuff. And the reason is, I mean, if you listen to that speech and you listen to the speech of Mr. Eisenhower, went back and listened to it right after the first atomic bomb, before we dropped the second, and listen to this clip, you can hear some of the same phraseology that Trump put into that speech.
Now, this is Truman, right?
I'm sorry, Truman, yes.
Here we go.
The ultimatum of July the 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware.
Wow.
So he's talking about Japan, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is before, one of the most significant munitions drops in all of history, right? If not the most.
Right.
So we have a I don't know, Trump eloquence and his ability to reference other leaders. I don't know. I don't know if he has that to the extent that he could conjure up that phrase the way that he did in the same type of scenario.
Was he channeling Truman? What do you think?
Truman was capable of some pretty belligerent talk, and that was. But keep in mind that was during a war, a world war that had been going on for years,
right.
and America had been in it for almost 4 at that point. So that was, or I guess 4. That was a very different context. But in after the war, when Truman announced the Truman Doctrine in the wake of the Soviet or insurgent threats in Greece and Turkey, he said it would be the policy of the United States to support free people from armed aggression, either from without or from within. That's a pretty broad statement, and what does it mean, to support it? Truman was capable of some pretty belligerent statements as well, and he was criticized for it both at the time and by historians subsequently.
So let me ask you this: Did he back that up?
Well, he dropped the bomb, so that pretty well backed that up.
Right.
And again, people argue about the Truman Doctrine. He did. He forged NATO and created an alliance that stopped Soviet expansion.
It was like why do historians criticize him? I mean, that was one of the best power plays in foreign policy history, right?
Well, they criticize him because they think that, and this was particularly true in the 70s and 80s. Historians from what is called the New Left criticized him for his belligerent position that they thought exacerbated the Cold War. Some even argue that he brought it on. It's kind of hard to ignore Stalin on the other side.
If you're a proponent of the New Left, you'll criticize anything that's rational, I think.
Well, perhaps, but there's a point somewhere in there that Truman's belligerence, and which at first was, I think, more rhetorical than not. The Soviets took for a genuine shift in American policy, and it probably did cause them to toughen their negotiating positions. Although
did that make the Cold War colder?
Yeah, I think that's a more reasonable approach.
The question I want to ask is every time Donald Trump opens his mouth about anything, there is a chorus of boos, and he's insane, and he's a nutball, and he needs to be impeached. And I mean, it goes, way beyond the pale of just, I disagree with that policy, and so did the same thing happen to Truman and other presidents who
not to Truman, but it certainly did to Reagan.
Right.
Reagan was considered to be a cowboy. It was considered to be, people called him ignorant. People called him reckless and irresponsible. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire and all the rest of this stuff. And people thought that he was going to bring about the end of the world, and he obviously didn't. I think one of the more interesting examples is a president who wasn't criticized much at his time, but historians have subsequently criticized for his bombastic rhetoric, and that's John Kennedy. Who was the author of some of the most bombastic rhetoric of the Cold War, and who did nearly blow up the world twice within a year.
Well, Cuban Missile Crisis.
And Berlin.
So when it comes to, I don't actually have any clips in the queue for that particular president. What are some of the things that he said that were particularly bombastic?
Hang on to that for a second. We're 2 minutes over. Peter wasn't watching. We're over here. Shame on me. I get so caught up in this. 721-1290 is our number. We have 4 lines open. If you'd like to visit with Dr. Michael Mayer and, of course, Mehrdad Kia joining us, John King, I'm Peter Christian, get involved in the conversation. It's a talk show, so we'd love to have you be involved. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. And, you know, I try to shame them into calling, and they call. Buck, first of all, thank you for holding during the break, sir. What's on your mind?
Oh, neat. I've just, always, Talkback, we were not strictly to the point. I don't know what Trump's policy is going to be. He's very hard to clarify, but I've been desperately wanting to vent on this subject because I haven't heard any talking heads, anybody address the fact. And, well, you know, it's time may not be on our side to do that, and we're generally not privy to our intelligence or CIA activities. The North Koreans are learning to circumvent legal and technical restrictions on talking over the border, reminiscent of the collapse of the Russian or the Soviet Empire. I mean, they're importing CDs that show life in the West, and I hope we are, and think we should try to foment their knowledge of the outside world, because probably even more than a government-less Sudan or something, they are the most civil rights abused society on the planet. If we could educate the majority of the common citizens, I don't think they would follow the regime and the top generals that are problematic. Should the country ever fall in a
Buck, let me tell you,
conflict.
we already have a toehold there with Dennis Rodman. If we can just get Katy Perry in there, to totally, ruin the youth of North Korea. I'm just kidding. I'm sorry.
You're like my broker now. You just bummed me out, left me depressed.
All right, Buck. Thanks for the call. So, what do you think?
I'm sure that the intelligence agencies are working on various sorts of things, but there are a couple of things to keep in mind. The Soviet Union, which was subject to subversion by Levi's and rock music and other things, probably more than anything else that brought the Soviet Union down.
Yeah.
But it's a huge country with lots of ethnicities, permeable borders, Radio Free Europe, and all kinds of things were able to penetrate. But more than that, just the experience of how much you could get for a pair of Levi's on the streets of Moscow or something was an indication of how much that had infiltrated. North Korea is a smaller country. It's much more tightly controlled. It's much more homogenous. It's probably more difficult to do that sort of thing there than it was in the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
And stay alive.
And also because its regime is much tighter control, there's less of it. There's less weak links to find. Although we have found some recently, we've had defectors. It's just a much more difficult to penetrate situation. I mean, imagine trying to get one friend of 3 to break away versus one friend of 15, right? It's just a much harder country to get a toehold in.
Okay. And there is also the element of China, right, which is a huge factor. And Mike, if you could elaborate on that, because in the beginning of this crisis, we immediately, like previous administrations, we're going to ask the Chinese to demand that he behaves.
Because they're our friends.
Yeah, and so much of their economy and so much of their security depends on China. So what is the position of China with regard?
It's a very good question, isn't it? I mean, and we're not sure. And Trump's first response was to try to get the Chinese to help out with this. And then they proved, as they have for the last 3 administrations, a lot less cooperative than any of the administrations had hoped, and then there's the inevitable frustration. I think China is worried in a couple of different directions. The last thing in the world they want is the North Korean government to collapse. They're worried about massive migration across the border. They're worried about instability on their border. They're terrified of the reunification of Korea, which would mean a country not particularly friendly to them right on their border. All of that worries the Chinese. And yet they're also kind of happy to see the North Koreans stick a thorn in our side periodically.
We got to take a quick question, but when we get back from that question, whatever it might be, I wanted to get your take on the UN Security Council vote to get China and Russia and the U.S. on the same side of the table in agreement when it comes to North Korea. Seemed like a shocking move by the Trump administration, and we'll talk about that.
And there is this also, isn't everybody else worried about the reunification of Korea? I think Japanese do not want to see it.
I think it was a unanimous vote.
Yeah.
Tell you what, we're up against a break, so I want to give Mark plenty of time to make his comment without cutting him off. I also want to get John's question answered, and we have another hour to talk at least about these issues. So if you have a question or comment, give us a call, 721-1290. We'll get you right on. Stay with us. Okay, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number, and we'd love to have you on. Let's get Mark on the line. First of all, Mark, thanks for holding. You're on. Go ahead.
Hello, guys. My question is, during the Cold War, there was radio-free Europe. So does South Korea have anything like that, or is there any way we can get them radios or cell phones to the populace to educate them?
All right, thanks for the call. So is there a similar type of procedure there?
I don't know. I assume the State Department and the intelligence agencies have something along those lines, but I don't.
Paper airplanes?
Yeah, I was going to say they do. They actually have done airplane drops.
Have they really?
Yeah,
okay.
they've dropped leaflets over North Korea.
Right.
But I think it's because of the lack of penetration of technology. I mean, you're talking about people who, many of whom don't have electricity. It's kind of hard to broadcast radios into their homes, and many of whom don't have enough to eat. So the access really is not there for the common people, and then the elites are benefiting from the system.
Yeah, it's the media in North Korea, from what I've been able to read about, is very tightly scripted. I did read it was actually a comic book about a real artist that lived. He's from Canada, but he lived in North Korea while he was working with this kind of interstate group, and he brought a book with him. It was the book 1984. And he talked about, in the comic, he talks about how, like living in the 1984 world, living in North Korea is like everything's scripted. People ask you questions about things you didn't think they saw, like when you're alone. And it's just a really spooky kind of situation where the media you can consume is very scripted. But anyway, back to my question about the 13. Getting all 13 members of the Security Council, getting most importantly, China, Russia, and the United States on the same team, apparently, when it comes to sanctions with North Korea. It's my understanding that in the past, the problem has been that China says they want to fight, North Korean aggression. However, they just keep trading them, giving them money, and basically are the supply network for that country. But now it looks like things might be a little bit different.
Maybe. It was an impressive feat of diplomacy to get the UN Security Council unified on this, and I think Nikki Haley has turned out to be a much more effective voice than most people who just look at a governor of South Carolina and figure, is that really somebody who's up to world diplomacy? And she really has been. Has been surprisingly impressive in that regard. On the other hand, it's one thing to get the Chinese to agree to it. It's another thing to get the Chinese to enforce it, actually to act on it, and we'll see what happens.
What they say and what they do are two different things.
Because basically what they would have to do to enforce it would be to crack down on their own business interests in North Korea. Companies that are run by plutocrats from China, which is basically what runs China. So it has to hurt itself.
They'd be arguing against their own self-interest, wouldn't they?
Yeah, except I guess on the other side is that, again, if they don't want the regime to come collapsing down. And on the one hand, if they withhold enough, they could bring the Chinese could bring the regime down in a few weeks economically if they wanted to. And yet they clearly don't want to do that. Even if they did want the regime to behave differently, they do not want thousands and thousands and thousands of North Koreans going across the border.
Wow. It's a crazy world. Anyway, we are almost out of time for this first half hour, but we are looking forward to your calls. 721-1290 is the number to call, and we'll be talking about what is the Trump doctrine when it comes to foreign policy. By the way, do you either of you have a clever phrase? Mine so far is brag about your big stick. That's the it seems to me.
We still have a half a minute left, so if you have a slogan, are any of you sloganeers in our?
I don't have a slogan, but in some ways, I think Trump's foreign policy is actually reinforcing what used to be the traditional alliances of United States, let's say, in Africa and Middle East, North Africa, and so on and so forth, where I think folks are more troubled with is his relationship with NATO and the traditional European allies. And that is quite a new one in some ways.
He has very little patience with that.
And then we can return to that when we come back.
Absolutely. We're going to come right back. Stay with us. Again, our phone number is 721-1290, 1-800-568-5309. And we have all 4 lines open, so get in the queue. So when we come back after the top of the hour, you can be first in line. We'll be right back in just a moment. Okay, we're back, and we're solving the problems of the world step by step here this morning. Dr. Mehrdad Kia, Dr. Michael Mayer joining us from the University of Montana, and, of course, John King. I'm Peter Christian, and we were right in the middle of discussing, where were we?
Well, we were talking about Trump's foreign policy, kind of coming to grips with what it is. And I'm going to make a claim here of my understanding so far of the way that Trump has handled foreign policy. And I'm going to make an executive claim, and I want you to disagree with me or agree with me, whatever you want to do.
I already disagree.
But first, I want to play a clip of what has been described as Obama's foreign policy. This is a speech that President Obama made late in his term. It's about 6 years in, but I think it represents mostly how he behaved towards foreign policy. And we'll go ahead and you can listen for the key words here. I'll tell you what it is after that.
Here we go.
One of the things I've learned over 6 years, and it doesn't always suit the news cycle, is having some strategic patience. You'll recall that 3 or 4 months ago, everybody in Washington was convinced that President Putin was a genius.
For taking credit.
And he had outmaneuvered all of us, and he had, bullied and, strategized his way into expanding Russian power. And I said at the time, we don't want war with Russia, but we can apply steady pressure, working with our European partners, being the backbone of an international coalition to oppose Russia's violation of another country's sovereignty, and that over time, this would be a strategic mistake by Russia. And today, I'd sense that at least outside of Russia, maybe some people are thinking what Putin did wasn't so smart.
By the way, the strategic patience line is actually something that was used more frequently by the administration. Susan Rice gave a whole speech about strategic patience. I think this was tried to shift away, and he called I'm sure the Obama administration would now like to have it called the backbone doctrine. But before that, the phrase was leading from behind. The idea basically being that U.S. is a strong enough tentpole in the world community. We can make other people flex their muscles for us. We don't need to be the one that's interacting directly or even close to proximity, and it's better for us to wait out bad situations than to confront them head on. That policy, it seems to me, is a policy of inaction, basically, and a policy that says the status quo should be intensified. And that's a similar doctrine, it seems to me, as to what happened during the Clinton era. And in both eras were a blossoming of the North Korean nuclear technology and their finances. Your take?
Well, I think Obama's confidence about strategic patience containing Putin proved to be a little misguided. I mean, after all, the guy invaded 2 countries, got away with it. He's still holding on to the Crimea and the eastern part of the Ukraine.
By the way, this is 2 years before the election in America where everybody's freaking out about how Russia interfered with the elections, right? So the strategic patience, I'm not sure, paid off.
Well, it didn't pay off in the Crimea or the eastern part of the Ukraine, certainly. And it didn't pay off in a number of other areas. And, some of this stuff is obviously political. I mean, people who apologize for the Soviet Union, the Gulag, the camps, the invasion of Hungary, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and so on, and the people who watched the rise of Putin, who didn't have much to say about the invasions of Georgia and the Ukraine, are now hysterical because they hacked Hillary Clinton or the Democratic National Committee. And I mean, is
priorities?
Priorities. Is that really the biggest thing that Putin has done? And now I don't mean to minimize interfering in American elections. It's serious business, but there's a certain amount of hypocrisy, and it was, after all, in spite of the sort of, I guess that was what passed for tough talk under Obama about Putin. there was a great deal of tolerance. And remember the comment into the open mic. Tell Vladimir, that I'll have more freedom after my reelection. This is my last election. I'll have more freedom after the next one. And strategic patience. I don't think the people of the eastern Ukraine are particularly patient with what's happening there now.
Can I just give my take on what John was talking about, this strategic patience? What I hear, again, as just the low guy on the totem pole, is if we wait long enough, my term will be over and it can be somebody else's problem. Okay, that's what I'm hearing. I really don't feel like doing anything right now. I don't really trust the military. I don't like them. So we'll just kind of hang out here and call it strategic patience. Yeah.
But by the way, it's not just, it wasn't just Obama that took a path of quote unquote strategic patience. Now, he did take it with almost every country in the world, but all the presidents basically have been doing that with North Korea.
Well, as I said, it's 3 administrations consecutively. I mean, Clinton came to that arrangement in '94 where he paid them billions of dollars to give up their nuclear program, and they took the money and advanced their nuclear program. Bush exercised with North Korea, what I guess could be called strategic patience, and so did Obama. And look where we are now.
And he put North Korea in the axis of evil speech, if you remember that. But that was just the speech, and he wasn't one of the countries that really got hit, right?
Right.
Well, let me ask you this: in comparison to the strategic patience, it seems like Trump, with his brag about your big stick doctrine, has apparently gotten more accomplished when it comes to North Korea in just a few short months.
Well, I mean, it's hard to know. It's hard to evaluate that because he was handed a bad hand. I mean, he was dealt a bad hand with this. He's the first president who not only has a North Korea that has nuclear weapons, but a North Korea that has missile technology and apparently the ability to miniaturize.
By the way, I don't know if you saw this. The miniaturization was known in 2013.
Yeah.
The information, the government knew about the ability to miniaturize. The Taepodong 3 has been in testing since I was in college. Mm. So they've had missile technology at least capable of hitting the west coast of the United States for years.
Yeah, but not dependably. I mean,
they still can't hit dependably.
Well, the targeting and getting the thing to go up and down is a different matter.
The lucky thing they can't find Montana because of the smoke right now, so that's a good thing. So we're up against a break. That's strategic patience right there. Anyway, 721-1290 is on. We'd love to hear from you folks. We're just going on and on here. We'd love to know what you think. 721-1290 is our number. 1-800-568-5309. We'll be right back. Hey, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is the number. John King, Peter Christian, Dr. Michael Mayer, of course, Dr. Mehrdad Kia joining us from the University of Montana History Department. And we're talking about the Trump doctrine and what's going on around the world right now.
And Mehrdad, you got a question.
No, yeah, I mean, let's get to the bottom of this in terms of what the options are for United States with regard to North Korea. Option one is to accept North Korea as a nuclear power country. And
bring them into the community.
Well, they will never come into any community, I don't think. But negotiate on that basis that this is de facto a nuclear power, which, of course, the president of the United States has rejected that notion. The second one is to go to an all-out war and destroy it. The third option is to hope and pray. Maybe the Chinese are working on this, is that there is a military coup within the elite itself. Mm. Because I don't think the country is on a stage that there's going to be a popular revolution against this totalitarian regime. And there might be a coup which will bring another strong man, but a strong man who is willing at least to negotiate. The last option is to go through more stringent sanctions, and where
that's already happened, hasn't it?
Well, not yet, because where we do know North Koreans do their business is a lot through China, Chinese banks, and so on, but also through Russia, and those stringent sanctions we have not still tested them completely because we are worried about Chinese response and to some degree the Russian response. So where are you, Mike, in terms of all those options on the table, and where we need to go?
Well, none of them are great options,
Yeah.
obviously. At this point, there really aren't good options. I think some combination of the last two, which you were talking about, probably make the most sense, at least at this point, which is a genuine economic pressure, sustained and really painful, not to the people because they're already suffering, but to the regime. And that might have some make some movement toward a regime change from within, and that may be the best that we could hope for.
So, if I'm not mistaken, the UN Security Council agreement implies future sanctions with future launches or tests. And I guess my question is, if those go into place, are those the type of sanctions you're talking about, Mehrdad, or were you looking for more?
Those sanctions can only be possible if China and Russia cooperate.
Absolutely, and on paper they have.
And I agree with Mike that this thing with United Nations was actually a big deal because we got the Russians and the Chinese on board on that. So they have made a commitment that there is a red line that he cannot cross. But whether they will then, in real everyday world, will they apply those? I am not sure, because I am sure the Chinese leadership and Putin are giggling every time he attacks United States, in his speeches and threatens United States with some kind of attack. So the Russians and the Chinese have a sort of a two-faced sort of foreign policy here. On the one hand, they have to act as responsible world powers. On the other hand, I don't think they mind that much the fact, as long as he's containable and he's controllable, that he's actually attacking and abusing United States.
So
and,
it sounds to me like what you're saying is that those regimes, they don't mind lying about, lying on the face when they're sitting in front of the United Nations. Yes, we'll do whatever it takes. Wink, wink, nod, nod, and then not do anything when the time comes to get it done. And so do they see that as an okay deal within their own structure?
Well, as long as it works for them. I mean, the notion that Soviet diplomats would lie or Chinese diplomats is about as shocking as gambling in Casablanca.
Sure. And it's been the par for international agreements for a long time. I mean, whatever climate accords we've agreed with, no one holds their end of the bargain, basically. Whenever foreign policy decisions with Russia and China, no one holds their side of the bargain, basically. I mean, it's like...
Well, why do we do it?
We do it to pretend like we're cooperating, and I'm sure there's underground talks about different stuff and threats that are made, but...
Well, imagine there was a guy in the presidency who really wanted to get stuff done and expected people to stand by their word, and if they didn't, he reacted. I mean, imagine if we had a president like that. I think we do right now. Yeah, whether you like him or not, I think that's the kind of person he is.
But it depends on what the reaction is and how effective. Again, when you make an agreement with the Russians or the Chinese, and when Wilson announced his 14 points, Georges Clemenceau, the premier of France, said, "God gave us the 10 Commandments. We broke them. Wilson gives us his 14 points. We shall see." And I think when you reach an agreement with the Russians, I think you have to take Clemenceau's perspective on that.
Let me ask you this: a lot of credit has been given to Nikki Haley for negotiating the UN security, and I no doubt that was a lot of effort. But I secretly think that a lot of the negotiation was actually done on behalf of Rex Tillerson, and it had to do with oil negotiations and energy contracts between China, Russia, et cetera. And they really are using the economic, and this is something about the Trump doctrine we haven't really talked about, the threat of nationalization of American companies and using our business power in ways that we haven't really done in the past. Even Democrats, Republican presidents haven't been willing to do, but Trump talks all the time about doing it and did in his run-up to the election. And I think that generally scares some of these people, especially even Russia and China. You might not be able to speak to them with honesty, but you can speak to them with money.
Yeah, I think I think one thing that may be behind Trump's policy, again, it's hard to know, but is the notion, and he has said this, that if we become a major energy exporter, it will do two things. It will reduce the price of oil, which will hurt the Russians, and it will reduce the dependence of Europe, in particular, on Russian energy supplies. which would enormously increase. Well, it would decrease Russian power and increase pressure on the Russian economy.
What do you think that we did with China? What do you think they threatened with China? Because there had to be some major threat.
It's hard to know. I mean, trade obviously is something that's always out there, and maybe there was
a tariff on goods from China or something like that.
Something like that, or some withholding some most favored nation or something. I mean, who knows what they may have suggested, but it's pretty much one of the few levers that the United States has.
We're up against a break. We're going to get Tyler on. If you'll hang on just a minute, Tyler, we'll get you on in a moment. We have 3 other lines open, 721-1290. What do you think is the solution to dealing with North Korea? I mean, we're tossing all these things around. All these things are being thought about, talked about in the halls of Congress and all over the world. What do you think, our ever-wise listening audience? I bet you have some good ideas. 721-1290. We'll be right back. Okay, thanks for joining us on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number, and we've been making Tyler wait throughout the entire break. Tyler, thanks for holding. You're on Talkback. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, guys. Did you guys see this morning Bloomberg has a story about 2 of Nikki Haley's staffers leaving?
I did see that.
I thought it was quite interesting after, Trump's comments and then the sanctions and with everything that's ratcheting up, and then all of a sudden, you get 2 of her top aides said, I'm done. I'm out.
They didn't really explain why, though, in the article I read.
They said family reasons, but we all know what that means. Somebody just didn't agree, I think, with what was going on and, chose to walk. But if you look at what's, going on, I don't think that we're really going to have a chance to see Trump's doctrine, especially within 200 days or maybe even the first term, because of all of the positions that keep moving and Congress that won't cooperate and everybody dragging their feet. I mean, Obama did everything he did with Congress that didn't agree with him and they didn't control. He did it all with fiat, and you got Trump who's trying to do it through Congress and do sanctions this way and that way, and everybody's just failing.
I mean, what part of Trump's foreign policy is he doing through Congress? It doesn't seem to mean much. He seems to be par for the course with Obama on that.
They haven't even funded the military yet, Don. They're talking about privatizing the military in Afghanistan because they can't get a funding bill through Congress. I mean, come on.
Well, I mean, that's like I said, par for the course. We hit how many fiscal cliffs through the Obama years? I mean, that's not new.
They did continual resolutions, and they funded everything and gave everybody more money every time, like an 8% increase in funds every year with a continuing resolution. He still got everything he wanted, even though they kept telling him no.
I guess what I'm trying to say to you is, like you said, that we won't be able to see what Trump's foreign policy is because Congress, et cetera, or you could say, I think other people might argue because of the media misrepresentation or situation of conflict between the media and the president, whatever. But I'm just saying, it seems to me that the position of the president when it comes to foreign policy is such a strong one as the executive decision maker when it comes to foreign policy, almost every single decision, that we will see a Trump doctrine when it comes to foreign policy, regardless of what Congress does.
Well, I don't think that Trump will let a country take over another country without firing a shot and say, we're going to strategically, patiently wait this out and see how it works out.
Now, that you're
He's
referring
a fighter.
I assume you're referring to the Crimea situation?
Right.
Well, thanks for leaving us with that, and thanks for your call, Tyler.
Good talking to you, Tyler. Thanks for the call.
Reeve has a comment on that as well, a question, because Mr. Mayor referenced the Crimea incident earlier when we were talking about strategic patience and Obama's kind of sit back and watch what happens sort of foreign policy. He says, if you're going to say that Obama could have done anything about Crimea, what would that have been? War? What could you do short of a war to actually stop Russia from taking Crimea? It seems easy to criticize, harder to give an actual solution to nuclear power. For a quick historical recap, maybe Mr. Mayor, you can give us, I know we had some sanctions that came into play. People criticize them for being weak sanctions at just a few. What is your take on what happened in Crimea when it comes to, and what we could have done?
Well, I think exactly that. There were sanctions, but they were relatively weak sanctions. Many of them were on individuals as opposed to larger, the larger structural of the Russian economy.
These were sanctions not intended to affect the public view of their government, which often sanctions are kind of for that. These were sanctions to irk the plutocrats that held the money bags in Russia, and that's about it, is my understanding.
Right, and that's the sort of thing when for sanctions to bite, and this is something that Mehrdad and I were talking about on the way in. If you look at in 1953 in Iran, when the British imposed sanctions, that they bit. I mean, that hurt the middle class, which was a large middle class, politically influential, and that in Iran I'm talking about, and that mattered. We did not do that sort of thing. To do that would have required a certain amount of leadership because you needed to get the Europeans on board, and the Europeans are very reluctant to do that sort of thing.
Can I throw the concept of the red line in here real quick, because I think it's an important part of Trump's policy, and one of the things I think he might do to get himself in trouble. If you go back and rewind the tape to the electioneering phase of the Trump era when he was running for office, he often criticized President Obama for using his red line in the sand statement when he was talking about the use of chemical weapons in Iran. Of course, there have been more chemical weapons. In Syria. Of course, there have been more chemical weapons in Syria since then. But even beyond that, if you could just play that one clip again, it's not that long, of Trump saying, this sounds to me like he's drawing a red line when it comes to North Korea that is extremely close, because he's basically saying, if you threaten us, we will do this.
Here we go.
North Korea's nuclear capabilities.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. He has been very threatening beyond a normal statement. And as I said, they will be met with fire, fury, and frankly, power, the likes of which this world has never seen before. Thank you.
There is one small two-letter word that is missing. The if. If he had said, if, they better not make threats. If they do, we will, use fire and fury. He didn't really say that. He could have been making one sentence and then another sentence.
He also used the term threats. And this is one of the problems with doing this sort of thing extemporaneously. Even if, as the administration says, they had talked about the general position that they were going to take, because threats mean a lot of things. Is a North Korean threat Kim Jong-un blabbering about something as he does, or is it moving military equipment into place? How do you define threat? And that really is open, and it's because of that. It's both short of a red line, but it's also not clear exactly what it means.
Real quick, I just want to finish the red line discussion with this. It seems to me that Crimea was also a red line. That was part of the NATO agreement. The alliance was built around the idea that none of the members could be attacked, or all of the members would be protected. Basically, it was, we're all one.
Article 5.
And that Article 5 doctrine was at its weakest point with the invasion of Crimea. We backed down, and despite whatever Trump might have said in the election when he was downplaying NATO, NATO looked weakest to me at the moment that Crimea was invaded and no one said anything, or did anything, really.
Okay, with that, we're going to come right back. 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. John King, Peter Christian, Dr. Michael Mayer, Dr. Mehrdad Kia, and you. We'd love to have you join the conversation. We're coming right back. Thanks for joining us on Talkback. 721-1290 is the number. We're talking about world affairs, things that are going on right now around the world, especially between the United States and North Korea, and, of course, Russia and China. All these things being discussed. And Marilyn is waiting on the phone. Marilyn, thanks for holding. You're on Talkback. Please go ahead.
So I'd like to know what sanctions means exactly, because last night I was listening to John Batchelor. It was pretty late at night. I wasn't able to take notes, but they were talking about the company and country where Mercedes-Benz originates, and the Korean president or prime minister or whatever you call him got a whole bunch of brand new Mercedes-Benz bought and brought into North Korea to appease the people that are around him, to keep them loyal and stuff. And apparently that happens a lot with a lot of other items and gifts and, material wealth and such. And so I guess, are other countries and companies, can you explain sanctions to me and how that works and how we hold, and do we hold or do we not hold other countries and companies accountable?
Okay, thanks for the call. So are there sanctions and then sanctions?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the policy of what a sanction is not a specific type. Maybe you can kind of explain briefly.
Sanction is a general term that means some sort of economic penalty or restriction. And there are all kinds of things. Embargo, for example, is an act of war. That would be the most extreme version. You cut off all trade.
Like, for example, a naval blockade of Cuba, like we did with JFK. Like, that would be a full-on embargo. You can't get anything in or out of the country, right?
Right.
But usually what it is like, okay, Iran, you cannot trade uranium with Iran. That's a given now. Or you can't trade high-end computers that might lead towards the development of a missile system. Or you can't trade certain types of metals that might be used in munitions, that sort of thing. But the worse a country behaves, theoretically, the tougher the sanctions might get. Like, we are not allowing you to have plastics or food or whatever. And it goes down the line. So theoretically, what the situation is now with North Korea, if they do another test or if they cross any more lines, basically, that were laid out in that UN charter, then our sanctions, which we already have pretty significant ones, will intensify.
But the key is to enforce them, and that often means to sanction. In other words, to penalize people who violate the sanctions. And that means whether, if it's a particular company, you might restrict their ability to sell in the United States or something like that. That would or penalize the country of origin.
Yeah, they're usually focused on two areas, as Marilyn's question suggests, on trade and banking, export, import, as well as banking, which is the source of revenue and cash. And if you prevent a country from selling its goods and importing the goods that they need in order to maintain the daily life of their citizens, and plus cash, that is the cash that it's inflowing. And North Korea uses quite a bit of Chinese financial system and banking system, but to some degree the Russian system, in order to receive both.
And that's an important distinction, because trade is very hard for us to enforce, because lots of countries produce, lots of countries consume. In banking, we really are the gorilla. And that's an area where the United States could exercise a greater degree of power, because in banking, we actually do, in world banking, we actually do have a very, very prominent place.
So real quick question for you, and to Marilyn's point. Marilyn was pointing out how weak the sanctions look in North Korea with all these Mercedes going in. And, sanctions, it's a table game. And you need everybody around the table in on the deal to isolate the country that you're trying to isolate, basically, because of their behavior. And if you look at a place like Cuba, you grow up in America, you can't get Cuban cigars. Well, actually, you can, but you can't. You're not supposed to get Cuban cigars because we have trade sanctions against Cuba, or had for many, many years. And the rest of the world was like, well, we're just doing whatever we want. You can trade with them. And so it was a really weak sanction situation. They could get whatever they wanted. We just didn't get what some smokers wanted in America. The same thing with North Korea. We have these sanctions on the table, fairly strict, but their biggest trading partner is right next door, China, and they're just breaking the rules all over the place. So it didn't really matter as much as it could or possibly should.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of North Korea, I think U.S. sanctions, unilateral sanctions, is pretty much meaningless, because we don't have much of trading or financial clout over North Korea. And that's why, more or less, we have been pleading with China to get into this and do something about it. And, of course, the Chinese foreign policy with regard to North Korea is very different and based on a different set of priorities than ours.
When I was in college, I went to a libertarian think tank kind of summit thing, and we debated the idea of sanctions, whether or not any sanctions were ever good. And the libertarians kind of grouped up in their critique in the similar fashion. I kind of wanted to see what you guys think of it. The idea was basically sanctions are pretty much always bad, because limiting the amount of trade you have with a country limits your amount of interaction, and thus strengthens the tensions between the two countries in favor of the most extreme view. The other part of it is that if you do impose sanctions, especially in a totalitarian state, which is usually who you're sanctioning, any amount of food, water increase that goes into that country will be in the hands of the power. They will look even more powerful because they're the ones who get to divide the food and divide the water and hand it out. They look like a god because they're the ones that have the thing you need and are able to give it to you. And they also get the choice of how much they give away and how much they keep for themselves. So it strengthens their position.
And of course, they can always blame you for the misery and suffering of their own people. I have to tell you, the North Korean leadership loves this right now, because they are being attacked by the sole superpower of the world, and the leader is standing up to the president of the United States. It enhances his popularity. At the same time, he can blame every internal problem that he has, economic or otherwise, on the United States and these sanctions.
Well, he got 99% of the vote. Yeah. I mean, how much more can his popularity go up?
That I think, John, is the one exception. It's always 100.
Yeah.
I don't know of any North Korean who dares.
I looked at the results on CNN. It was 99%.
Stalin always got 99%
Well, they didn't want to be,
of the vote, but
they didn't want to be too overconfident.
Yeah. But Mehrdad's point's well taken. I mean, Castro spent decades playing exactly that game. You don't have anything because the United States has sanctions. And in a series of 5-hour speeches, he explained why that the real problem was the United States and that he was standing up to the United States.
Now, we're up against a break. 721-1290 is our number. 1-800-568-5309. If you have your KGVO app, you can use that as well. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Oh, yeah. 721-1290 is the number. This is Talkback, and it's kind of the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio, but not really. We're talking about world affairs. And Dr. Mehrdad Kia, Dr. Michael Mayer, John King, I'm Peter Christian, and we have Facebook comments.
That's right. First, Katie says, where is Japan in all of this? It's funny. I went to Japan 2005, shortly after they threw a Taipodong into the sea. It went right over Hokkaido, where I was living at the time, and they were freaked the heck out, right? They know because of their past malfeasance, Japan, I'm saying, and the persecution that they put the Koreans under during World War II and before. They know that they are the hated country in the region and one of the most likely places to receive a nuclear weapon if one were to be launched. And the enmity between these two countries is almost irreconcilable, especially when they're isolated by a totalitarian rulership like Kim Jong-un. So I'm guessing where they're at is they're freaked out.
I think, a couple of things. First, we started the program with Doctrine, Nixon Doctrine, Reagan Doctrine. I think to have a doctrine when you have a bipolar world is much easier. You have the Soviet bloc, you have the United States and its allies. It's much easier to sort of figure out, what the
world makes a whole lot more sense.
Yeah. The configurations. I remember on his way out, the Soviet leader Gorbachev said, well, you're laughing at us. We'll be laughing at you. Once you have a world of many different power centers, which we do today. You have China, you have India, you have Brazil, you have European Union, you have Russia. So it's a far more complicated sort of reality. And for this reality to have a doctrine on par with that of Nixon or Reagan will be far more difficult. But I think the question that Peter has raised during the break, the reality of within this sort of polar, sort of power world, what happens if a war actually breaks out? What will happen to Japan? And what will happen to South Korea?
Yeah.
Because anybody who has traveled, I think, to South Korea will know the proximity of North Korean missiles and the proximity to Seoul, the capital of South Korea, the beautiful capital of South Korea.
Like Frenchtown.
and how close they are.
Yeah.
And just the beginning of that conflict and the kind of casualties that we are speaking about is unthinkable right now. So
we definitely need to go into that, but before we need to take this call real quick.
Absolutely.
Let's get Hunter on the line. Hunter, you're on Talkback with our guests. Please go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you again for taking my call. And again, all this has created conflicts that, from my studies of human-induced and human-created conflicts, I've always said is developed countries have the sources to create all these human-induced conflicts. Talking about threats, history, what history would say about threats to any part of the world, again, would be developed countries who create threats to these undeveloped countries. Banking, yes, which was great, whoever brought that up, that, again, drugs became the problem that it is today because of money. So who went around the world slapping money on natural resources? Gun violence, not just around the world, but in this country. Gun violence is created by who? That's
what is your answer to the questions you're asking?
Well, my point here is, we're you guys played a clip of Trump talking about threats to the U.S. It's very simple here. Developed countries have always had the sources to influence undeveloped countries, and if developed countries just quit influencing or creating conflict, the main key here is creating conflict.
So your basic argument, if I were to sum it up, is that the developed countries of the world are the source of most of the world's problems.
Exactly.
And how do you view that in light of the scientific advancement and the liberties provided by these first world countries?
Well, it's created for conflict to create conflict.
Do you live in Missoula?
I do.
Okay. Do you find yourself in a constant sense of conflict?
As here in Missoula?
Yeah.
Absolutely, because here's the thing.
With whom?
Here's the thing. Okay, I'm not a white American, but I was born and raised here in America. I've never been viewed as a Missoulian.
What nationality? What nationality are you?
I'm not going to say. I'm not going to say for the protection of my purpose.
Okay.
Okay.
But at the same time, constantly being born and raised here in Missoula and being born and raised here in America, constantly, every year I always face being called whatever racial names and being told to go back to my country. So my point here is, history would say, gun violence is created in this. Okay, let me answer this one question. Let me ask you this question. Gun violence in this country was created by who?
Gun violence was created by who?
Violence.
Gun violence, like in all cultures, was created because of our human nature.
No, created by who in this country?
I don't believe there's a single source for it.
Yes,
gun violence is one person pulling a trigger on another person. If you didn't have gun violence, you'd have knife violence and stick violence.
Okay. Let's look in history. Let's look into your history, John.
Okay, Hunter, I hate to do this to you, buddy, but we only have a few minutes left in the show, and we're going down a completely different track. So I humbly apologize, but we're going to have to let you go because we are up against a break. Thank you for your perspective, though. We appreciate it. We're going to get Bruce on in just a minute. We have a 1-minute timeout, and we'll try to wrap up what we're talking about here between North Korea and America and China and Russia and all that. So I apologize for shutting you down, but we had to kind of move along the track. We'll be back in just a minute. Oh, yeah. 721-1290 is the number, 1-800-568-5309. We try to provide respect for everybody. There you go. John King's over there. I'm Peter Chris. Let's get Bruce on the line. Bruce, you've been waiting. Thank you for your patience. What's up?
Oh, thanks, guys. I tuned in a little bit late. I was wondering if anybody addressed the theory of giving South Korea and Japan defensive nukes. I know that would go over like the turd in the proverbial Chinese punch bowl, but any chance that might happen? Because I think that would be one maybe kind of solution to this whole.
So let's expand the nuclear community. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, well, defensively, maybe, yeah.
Okay, all right. So thanks for the call, Bruce. Gentlemen, what do you think? Right, pointing at each other. Dr. Meyer, go ahead.
Well, actually, Trump mentioned that a couple of times during the campaign, and it did not receive a very positive reaction. And the gist of foreign policy of the major powers over the last number of years has been to try to limit nuclear proliferation. I think it's going to be harder and harder. The technology's out there. It's more available. I mean, let's face it, if North Korea has it, Iran has it or is going to get it, and who else? Somebody in a cash-poor country like North Korea, the best thing they can do is sell some of this. So who knows?
Well, let's do another phone call. Jason. Jason, you're on Talkback. Go ahead. Hello, Jason.
Hey, this is.
Turn your radio off. There you go.
Maybe a propaganda type solution where they were to drop notepads or something and tell them how bad they actually are or how bad the regime actually is.
Yeah, we actually discussed that. That has been tried in North Korea, right?
Yeah, they have. They've dropped pamphlets.
But they can't read. So,
by the way, there is a constant attempt to try to educate the North Koreans about how horrible their situation is. And of course, that goes both ways. The government is trying to show them that the rest of the world is a hellhole and they live in a utopian society.
And by the number of defectors from North Korea and many who escaped North Korea and who refused to actually cooperate with the regime, including the leader's own brother who was assassinated, who was murdered. I do not think that North Koreans in general are completely unaware. I think there are segments of the population that are probably, and if you read the State Department reports and so on, it clearly shows that though there is, and I agree with Mike, lack of technology and lack of cell phones and so on and so forth, North Koreans are not completely unaware of this either. But to what degree that awareness can then translate itself into political action against such a brutal regime, that's a whole different ballgame.
Real quick, Peter asked a question during the break earlier that needs to be addressed, and that's the idea of a first strike from either side. Yeah. If the U.S. were to strike North Korea, or if North Korea were to strike, what would unfold?
Nobody knows for sure. I mean, any general will tell you that a battle plan is fine until the first contact with the enemy, at which point it falls apart. Nobody knows. Nobody can predict what step. What would happen. This would happen. That would happen. The one thing, and I think you've seen several of the top officials in the Trump administration who are generals talk about, is the enormously high number of casualties that would result. I mean, even short of a nuclear exchange, and a nuclear exchange would just multiply that.
So a lot of Americans understand what we have, our resources. We have bombs, we have missiles, we have all kinds of technology. We would probably try not to put as many people on the ground as we could and use mostly missiles. It's a smaller-ish nation. But what kind of cards does North Korea hold? Because they actually hold quite a few when it comes to threatening their neighbors.
Well, they have thousands and thousands of artillery pieces aimed at Seoul. Seoul's within range, easy range of artillery. And so just getting off a couple of rounds would produce tens of thousands of casualties. And that's not even beginning to talk about their ability to put a nuclear warhead on a medium-range missile or a short-range missile. So I mean, the capacity to inflict violence, then also Japan, too, is within.
But Dr. Mayer, wouldn't that be nationalistic suicide for them to do that?
You would think. But a lot of people, and people always say, we've talked about this, history teaches. History doesn't really teach us much because it's always a little different. But people think that weapons are too terrible to be used. That was the theory that prevented World War I, except it didn't.
Right.
These dreadnoughts are just too powerful. Nobody will ever start a war. Well, guess what?
Yeah.
And people miscalculate. They miscalculate the capacity or the willingness of an opponent to take X or Y step, and then all of a sudden you're there. I mean, that certainly is the guns of August in 1914. This is it's so hard to predict,
and then it happens so quick.
Yeah, and especially today, because we're not talking about mobilizing armies in Europe in 1914 or even 1939.
Press a button.
Yeah, and it takes 40 minutes or something for a slow ballistic missile, intercontinental ballistic missile, to get from Korea to the East Coast of the United States.
Can you give listeners a picture of how many people are at the border right now between North Korea and South Korea, including our own servicemen?
Yeah, we have what do we have?
60,000.
60,000. It's a lot of people.
My brother was one of them. He served there.
I mean, that's, even if we just lost 60,000 Americans, imagine the tragedy, the families affected.
So far, though, I mean, we may conclude with this, is that North Korea seems to want this technology and this capability as a deterrent, not as an offensive weapon. Because as you suggested, John, it would be absolutely suicidal if they take the first, military attack. So based on that pre-assumption, I think we are negotiating, in the backdoor negotiations, to say we understand you need a deterrent, but you're actually crossing a line to a point that it might actually make a conflict unavoidable.
Somebody's got to be the grown-up here, right? Is that it?
And that's why I would like our leaders to take a little bit of backseat and bring the temperature down and begin to put more diplomatic, economic, financial pressure rather than talking about fire and fury.
Gentlemen, we are out of time. Thank you so much for your perspective. We really appreciate it, especially historically speaking. You guys are great at that. We appreciate you being with us today. Tomorrow, of course, it's Catching the Big Ones. We won't go there. But from 8 until 9, then we'll have open phones from 9 until 10. Hopefully, we'll hear from Kirsten Pabst as well, our county attorney. Have a great day, and don't breathe too deeply.